Hi, my name is Mickey Richardson, and I would like to do my assignment this week on the connection between Job and the legalisms that are expressed by Job's friends. First of all, let's do a little look at the history of Job and the authorship of the book. Um, Most scholars believe that Job was written while the Israelites were in exile. The Israelites had lost their home, their temple, their families, and their corporate identity. Most scholars believe that it was written somewhere between 597 and 539 BCE. At the time that it was written, the Israelites were living in what we would call a Babylonian ghetto. They were trying to rationalize why God had brought them to this particular point in their life. They had been so great and had fallen so far. The Israelites could see themselves reflected in the character of Job, while his patience, and we often use the term or the cliche, the patience of Job, but if we read, actually Job's patience ran out after the second chapter, and so for the other remaining 40 or so chapters, I think we could call it the endurance of Job, perhaps. So his patience soon ran out, but his endurance lasted, and during that time that he was enduring his ailments and his suffering, he wrestled with his friends and ultimately with God and the God of the whirlwind. His wranglings centered around the legal definition of justice and of truth. And if we think about, look back, according to Unger's commentary, Job is probably one of the earliest written books of the Old Testament. In other words, it was probably written down before most of the other books of the Old Testament were written down. And I think that's important because it shows us what their primary concern was. They were mourning, they were suffering, and they needed answers to human suffering. How often do we search in Scripture for our own answers to our human suffering? And we wonder, where is God during major crisis or major disasters? And I think sometimes we turn to Job. And I think that's exactly what the Israelites were doing. They were suffering. They had lost everything. And supposedly, they were looking for answers as to why. What justice did God have in placing them there? And I think ultimately we come up with, well, they had gone into apostasy, is what the authors eventually, biblical Old Testament authors eventually come to the conclusion that they had fallen away. But let's see what Job, the author of Job, says. He says essentially that they want to know why they have been brought to this point. They want to challenge the legal definitions of truth and justice as perceived by the Jewish faith, by the Jewish community. So in verse 38, in chapter 38, God begins to explain his definition of justice. This is after Job's friends have all given their definition and tried to convince him that he apparently had been a victim, or apparently had done something wrong, that he had blasphemed, that he had failed in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord was coming back on him. But in verse 38, we hear from the God of the whirlwind, and he redefines the concepts of justice against what the Jewish perception of justice was at that time. And so in chapter 38, the author looks to redefine their understanding of justice and truth. He says first that God's justice is accountable to no one. And that's in 38, 1 and 2. Secondly, God's justice is beyond human understanding and rationale. That's also in 38. 3. God's justice and truth is more powerful than we can imagine. And that's in chapter 40. And fourth, God, and this is the first time we get these two understandings, God is omnipotent and omniscient. And that is in chapter 42, verses 1 through 3. And it's important because all the other religions of that time and space believed that their deities were neither omniscient nor omnipotent. And so for the Hebrews to come forth and proclaim their deity, their God, the Yahweh, as both omnipotent and omniscient from the very beginning, from their earliest writings, is very important. And that's in chapter 42. Chapter 40, verse 7 is an interesting one. I want to highlight that because essentially the Lord is looking at Job and saying, hey, put your big boy pants on. We're going to have a big boy conversation. In modern times, as Christians, we sometimes say, hey, we're going to have a come to Jesus meeting. Well, this was Job's come to Jesus meeting. And essentially the author is saying, hey, we're coming to terms with our innocence, and sometimes bad things happen to good people. And it's for no other the reason than there is evil in the world. There's an adversary in the world. Satan exists, and you know that, and I know that. And so sometimes bad things happen when people don't expect it, or when they shouldn't happen. I often think of natural disasters that have happened in our own country. I think back to the major Hurricane Katrina that hit the Gulf Coast. And when I do, where I live, one of the popular sayings or cliches after that was that the Lord was dealing with the city of New Orleans for its many sins. And so we have to, that's a very Jewish perspective. That's a Sodom and Gomorrah perspective, that they did something wrong. They failed the Lord. They displeased God, and so God essentially either directly or indirectly either caused or allowed this hurricane to descend upon the citizens of New Orleans. And what the author of Job is saying is essentially, no, that's wrong. God's justice does not work that way. God's legalisms are not defined as the Jewish law perceives them. And I think that most of us can understand that what happened in Katrina was not a direct correlation to God. And I think most of us realize that sometimes bad things happen, even to people who are upright. That our lives are more about endurance than they are about our patience. And so that's what I wanted to highlight in Job. And I hope that that you enjoyed, and that you think when you go through suffering and there is no apparent reason for your suffering, that you don't become as Job's friends did and define your suffering by your spirituality. Thank you.